A special thanks to our presenter, Associate Professor Jeremy Slack. Jeremy Slack is an associate professor in the Sociology and Anthropology Department at UTEP, our sister institution to the south. He is also the faculty fellow for community engagement, and the area in which he's engaging is the subject of his talk today. I met Jeremy about 5 years ago when we got together to talk about collaborative research work, and I've just admired his work in the last 5 years as I've gotten to know him. He's worked for the last 15 years in the United States-Mexico border, kind of at the juncture of border immigration interdiction, and asylum issues. As a result of his extensive work, he's recently published a book with the University of California Press, Deported to Death: How Drug Violence is Changing Migration on the US-Mexico Border. I'm really looking forward to him sharing some of his insights today. And with that, I'm going to step down to the role of technical support and introduce our speaker, Jeremy Slack. Jeremy, thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. Too bad we couldn't do it in person, but the good thing is I'm close by to everybody, and hopefully we can have some time to do that in the future. As Dr. Brown was saying, I've worked a lot on issues related to immigration and how this drug-related violence issues in Mexico have impacted the experience for migrants and deportees. And that has led to a lot of work in asylum as well. And so I want to give a kind of a short talk here that's related to my book and some other more recent publications. And then hopefully give some time to open it up to questions, right? I think a lot of people are really struggling to keep up with what happened during the Trump administration or continues to happen during the Trump administration. And so having some time to discuss some of those changes and what's going on is really, really important. So I will start with an excerpt here from my book. He stuck his hand between the door when I turned my back. I didn't see them coming. Before I knew it, they were inside and their guns pointed at us, threatening to do something to my wife or to me or to burn down the institution, a migrant shelter. It was a very serious threat. One of the Zetas, because he identified himself as a member of the Zetas cartel, spoke to me very calmly in a certain way. We want to take these two people. There is a patero, a human smuggler, that is not reporting to us. We want to know who crossed them. We will ask them for code words. If they have the codes, we will leave them alone and not bother them anymore. If they don't have the codes, well, it's because someone crossed them and they're not with us. The longtime staff member, Lazaro, froze. I immediately contacted the priest in charge of the shelter and told him, Padre, we have a situation here. Lazaro, let them go. We can't do anything, the priest replied. So I said, you have to leave, muchachos. La Casa Migrante can't do anything for you. The group of migrants started to scream and plead not to be let them be taken. I let them take them, and I never saw them again. What else could I have done? These incursions into migrant shelters have been common in northeastern Mexico. I still hear their screams, Lazaro said. The incident happened shortly after I left the shelter, where I had been conducting ethnographic research from 2013 to 2014. But similar events had happened throughout the Northeast. The young men who were taken were originally from Michoacan, a central Mexican state and also an area controlled by one of the Zetas' mortal enemies, La Familia Michoacana. Being deported to Tamaulipas placed them in danger, since the Zetas are always suspicious of deportees coming from territories controlled by rival gangs. When the Michoacanos were walking to the shelter, two young lookouts, known as halcones, falcons literally, who monitor the people coming and going from the shelter, stopped them to interrogate, a common practice. They were big guys, as tall as you, Lazaro explained, and did not pay attention to the halcones who were little kids. The deportees pushed past the lookout, shoving one hard against a fence. The other lookout went and called on his radio, and the reinforcements arrived. The trucks came with armed men, said Lazaro. Simple missteps like this could have cost these two young men their lives. Being a deportee along the border is a dangerous world, one with complex rules and a shifting terrain that has put migrants squarely in the sights of organized crime. Events like this are rarely publicized, as the organizations that run shelters do not want the negative publicity and potential closure, nor do the police or organized criminal groups from the area want these activities known. But this leaves some questions about what drug traffickers, once famous for their gaudy lifestyle and excessive wealth, would want with relatively poor deportees and migrants. These hidden tragic events are the backdrop for the high-profile massacres in the region, particularly the killing of 72 Central and South American migrants in San Fernando, Tamaulipas in August of 2010, 10 years ago. For this talk, I want to focus on the ways that north-south as well as east-west movement along the border creates a geography that is in direct conflict with the violence generated between different factions of organized crime in Mexico. This requires understanding how the criminal justice system in the United States, principally interior enforcement measures and zero tolerance trials for illegal entry and illegal re-entry, have clashed with the chaotic conflict over drug trafficking routes in Mexico. Through our mixed methods research project, the Migrant Border Crossing Study, which included post-deportation surveys, as well as ethnographic research with deportees in Mexico, I want to discuss the ways that our criminal justice system has served to exacerbate danger for deportees upon removal, something that has only increased with the changes to asylum in border cities that has resulted in people stuck in these dangerous situations. So this really demands that we attend to both the north-south migration movement as well as east-west along the border. While north-south movement is largely driven by social networks, as people tend to follow friends and family through the same regions of the border, east-west is largely driven by US immigration enforcement and the criminal justice system. Both of these issues have important impacts on asylum, as well as the high potential to expose people to violence and torture upon removal to Mexico. So this research was really conducted from about 2007 until 2015 with follow-up visits, kind of several weeks or several months in 2016, 17, and 18 along the US-Mexico border. There's some more recent research that I've been doing that I'm not including directly in this talk, but I think it's worth discussing in terms of changes from the Trump administration, such as making people wait in Mexico for their asylum hearings, migrant protection protocols, as it's called. But we did surveys in Tijuana, Mexicali, Baja California, Nogales, Sonora, Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, and Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, as well as in Mexico City when people are sent back by airplane. Each survey lasted approximately 1 hour, and I also included ethnographic research in Tamaulipas and Baja California and Sonora over this period as well. I've continued to work on this project in a number of different ways, also with the detained asylum seekers who are fighting their cases in the different detention centers in El Paso and in Otero, New Mexico. So this data is unique in that the individual experiences of border crossers can really help us understand the difference of how programs are presented to the public versus how they are enacted in the real world, and some of the unintended or perhaps intended impacts of enforcement. And a lot of this really has to do with the overlying logic of enforcement these days, which is basically called a consequence delivery system. And so this is really an escalation of previous kind of prevention through deterrence measures that really push people to cross between cities into these remote areas. And this is really using the full brunt of the carceral state against immigration offenders. So instead of simply returning people quickly to Mexico or to their home country, what we're seeing now is each individual having an individually tailored punishment. And this often can be in a number of different programs. One of them is the lateral repatriation. So this alien transfer and exit program, as it's called, where people are apprehended in one region of the border and sent to another part of the border, as well as Operation Streamline. Operation Streamline is part of this zero tolerance approach where people are charged with USC 1325 or 1326, illegal entry or illegal reentry. It's kind of got a lot more famous because it was one of the main ways that children were separated from their parents under the Trump administration. So sending asylum seekers who cross between ports of entry to prison and taking their children away from them. by using this mechanism, but it really did ramp up under the Obama administration. However, they didn't use it against asylum seekers, as well as kind of more recent programs such as the Migrant Protection Protocol, this waiting in Mexico, as well, and metering, which is essentially making people wait at the port of entry, take a number, and then be able to apply for asylum later. These all created tens of thousands of people stuck and waiting in border cities. And more recently under COVID, there's the Title 42 returns, which I can talk about later if you want, but it's essentially no asylum for anybody, right? People are sent directly back to Mexico, sometimes their home countries, but mostly Mexico, and just said, see ya. So it is kind of a really, really draconian approach right now, but it's still kind of pretty under the radar. But so more and more immigrants are being arrested and being charged with illegal entry and illegal re-entry. These are kind of, again, last year, the most common federal crimes. So they've sort of played back and forth between these immigration charges and drug charges in the United States, but really a massive amount of people being charged with illegal entry. And once they're kind of sent into the prison system, they're sent to federal facilities and then transferred to immigrant detention facilities before removal, right? And this really results in some confusing and disorienting movement through this array of public and privately operated facilities, prison, immigration detention. And this really kind of makes it very difficult to track people's movements. People often don't even know exactly where they are upon repatriation. And so this really is especially difficult when someone is charged with drug crimes along with immigration crimes. And so, for example, Jonathan, a 46-year-old campesino from Hermosillo, Sonora, was deported wearing the trademark pale gray sweatpants, sweater, and navy blue slip-on shoes that they give you when you leave federal prison. He had spent 6 months incarcerated for smuggling marijuana through the Arizona desert. I needed some extra money because I'm taking care of my son. He's older, your age, he said, pointing at me, but he can't work. He's not right in the head. He had walked for 6 days with 80 pounds of marijuana on his back. They were going to pay him $1,600, but he got caught. Now he was in Tamaulipas, land of the Zetas, who are fighting the Sinaloa cartel that controls Sonora. Everything is very controlled here. I don't want them to look at me like I'm the enemy, he said, nervously clenching his fists. Jonathan, apprehended in Arizona, had been spit out of this complicated geography of the US prison system into a completely foreign region of the border. The danger that Jonathan fears is real. As one shelter worker described, being born in the wrong place can be catastrophic. This map, although flawed, demonstrates some of the hidden borders that people must contend with upon return, namely the warring Sinaloa cartel and Los Zetas. There was a deportee who was from Sinaloa, and his crime, the only crime, was telling people he was from Sinaloa. It was about 2 meters from the migrant shelter, and they were beating him. They beat him horribly. They stripped him naked, put him face down, and were standing on his hands. They hit him in the butt with a paddle, el tablazo. I stopped in front of them, and one of the kids, chavos, told me, "There's enough for you too, come here. There's enough for you too." I tried to call the police, but it was 2010 and the municipal police were totally corrupt, bien metido. We saw the police stopped right in front, laughing at the spectacle happening in front of us. When they stopped beating the deportee, Lazaro went to him. We dragged him a little bit and then got him inside. We gave him clothes because he was naked and wrapped him in some sheets. We immediately took him to the Red Cross, but he was so bad, man. Fractured ribs, black eye. They said he was probably going to lose his eye. His butt, his pompies, super bad. I swear I cried from rage. I had those images in my mind of what happened right in front of me. I was even more angry that it happened right in front of the police. The regional power structure in northeastern Mexico, dominated by the Zetas and the Gulf cartel that with their rivals, the Sinaloa cartel to the west, create an impediment for movement that augments the danger for people who unwittingly cross these lines. Those born in enemy territories, people with visible tattoos and other markers of having been in prison, such as clothing, are subject to scrutiny and interrogation. However, the shifting border dynamics produce other micro boundaries that mitigate movement by deportees. Here we see an unexpected consequence of merging the criminal justice system with our immigration enforcement apparatus. Because Jonathan was convicted of a crime and placed into federal custody, It caused them to be transported thousands of miles before being removed into an entirely unfamiliar and inherently dangerous part of the border. People born in enemy territory or others who have participated in drug smuggling are immediately viewed as a threat. However, others, especially those who have spent decades in the United States, face extra scrutiny for other reasons, especially kidnapping for ransom, which has become an increasingly important part of the economic profile of criminal organizations. And this has become all too common since interior enforcement practices remove people from the US after long periods, many of whom no longer have contacts in Mexico. Their ties to the United States made them well-known target for kidnapping since the US families can usually come up with a higher amount for ransom. Both the criminal justice system and immigration enforcement policy have directly exacerbated this phenomenon in other ways. So in the early 2010s, we saw a dramatic increase in the people being returned to Tamaulipas that did not correspond to the number of individuals apprehended entering the states. This is only Mexicans in this graph here. The gap shows that about 70,000 more individuals were returned to the Northeast than were apprehended in that area. And this is particularly concerning since these were the years immediately following the massacre of 72 migrants. While this was a temporary difference, we should note that because the levels have evened out, there's not necessarily the same people that are being removed as those that are being apprehended. And as I stated earlier, there's other programs that are trying to concentrate more and more people in these areas. Furthermore, we've also analyzed data that was obtained by the Connecticut chapter of the American Immigration Council through FOIA litigation, which really reveals that the criminal alien program, this kind of umbrella organization, this program that removes people, it encompasses a couple of different ways that people are removed, but it broadly talks about all people that are apprehended and arrested in the United States and removed. And this shows this sort of distribution of where people are sent, right? So almost 80% of all criminal aliens are removed in either South Texas or through Southern California. And part of this is possibly linked to the size of the prison population in Texas and California, but nevertheless, this concentration has severe impacts for individuals and the region. And it really causes us to question this consequence delivery system, right? At what extent is exposure to organized criminal violence a part of this border enforcement strategy? And in a recent article that we published in the Annals of the Association of American Geographers, we really talk about how this connects to the Trump policies, because we see that this has become more and more explicit, right? These programs are more and more designed to keep people trapped at the border, especially in some of the more dangerous places, as a way to dissuade them from either crossing the border or applying for asylum. Also, this is some data that we found in our survey of individuals who were deported to those different regions. So comparing this, we see that people are much more likely to have been arrested by the police than the Border Patrol, which also indicates that you're living in the United States and not immediately crossing the border. And so this really is this kind of guiding of agents towards a specific consequence for certain types of people. And so with over 100,000 people charged with immigration crimes in 2017 alone, it really has drastically changed what it means to be a criminal in terms of these types of persecutions. And so the concentration of people with criminal records in the Northeast leads to a particularly vicious cycle and throw fuels on the fires of violence in that region. When deportees arrive after being incarcerated, they're usually wearing prison clothing, blue and orange slip-on shoes, these baggy sweaters and khaki pants, and they almost never have Mexican identifying documents and frequently lack some of the cultural and linguistic skills to blend in what was once their home country. You know, having spent years and years here, the saddest thing often is to talk to people that are culturally and tied to the United States, right? They consider their home to be in the United States because their lack of understanding and awareness of Mexico and what they need to do really puts them in extreme danger. And people are watching out for these types of individuals. They're hiring individuals who worked as smugglers to make sure that they can identify those who have the strongest ties to the United States because they're the best at paying ransom. And everyone works really hard to make sure they get rid of these signifiers of their time in the United States, right? The shelters fill up with bags and bags of prison clothes and shoes, and people quickly tried to rid themselves of these garments and would rather wear ill-fitting or seasonally inappropriate clothes. Like people would drop off their slip-on shoes and wear sandals during winter, just to make sure that they don't get identified. Because the consequences can be severe, as individuals are often killed or tortured based on where they were born. And this is even sparked violent events at shelters. Similar to the first vignette that I read, the priest where I conducted my fieldwork was abducted and disappeared in 2019 after intervening to protect a group of Cubans who were deemed suspicious by the cartel. And now all of this gets really at the heart of our dismantled and overloaded system for asylum. And as I've worked in this system for a while, I think it's important to talk a little bit about the specific dynamics of these issues, right? So who can I deport? The judge barked at me. I was testifying on behalf of a man who had been in the United States for over 20 years. His whole family was US citizens. He had been arrested for using fake identity to cross the border. He had witnessed his friend murdered in front of him and left Mexico in fear. After arguing that this man would face danger in Mexico because he would be perceived as wealthy and essentially a foreigner in what is no longer his home country, I struggled to respond, knowing full well that I have to placate the judge because he and he alone determines the fate of this individual. What I wanted to say was that we should recognize the harm and danger people are being placed in due to removal as far more serious than the law assumes, that people are being systematically targeted after deportation, and that people who have spent a lifetime in the United States have a right to be here with their families. I didn't say that though. I tried to make the distinction between those who come, work, and want to go back, that while there are many people who are tied to the US, there are many of people that are not. The judge's palpable frustration at my argument displayed a truth of the immigration courts. They are designed and incentivized to remove people en masse and as fast as possible. The asylum system includes a very precise set of guidelines outlining which types of violence can be considered valid fears of persecution. Judges attempt to determine which forms of violence classify individuals for protection. So thinking about what Mbembe has written about necropolitics, which is really the way that our politics shape which types of death and violence are presented as acceptable or legal, they ask, under what practical conditions is the right to kill to allow to live or to expose to death exercise? Who is the subject of this right? What does the implementation of such a right tell us about the person who is thus put to death and about the relation of enmity that sets that person against his or her murderer? The racial and colonial hierarchies that designate these rights have never been more apparent than at the border and among those asking for protection. In the asylum courts, however, it fits the mold of a certain type of necroliberalism, whereupon we see the supposed gifts of our liberal democracies being bestowed or withheld on the basis of a set standard few would recognize as our legal system. Rather than simply a politic of whose death matters, necroliberalism points out which deaths or potential deaths should be granted clemency. This is precisely the role of the immigration judge, deciding whose deaths, or rather, which types of deaths should matter. Is there state involvement or is it just crime? Can they relocate internally in their home country? Did someone actually harm them or was it simply a threat? Meaning essentially that one should stay long enough to be harmed, but not quite long enough to be killed before leaving. It's a challenging proposition. All the while evaluating whether or not an individual who wants to be released from detention is truly worthy. Because as one judge here in El Paso puts it, if you were really afraid, you would not mind being locked up here. These types of questions seek to exclude, even validate certain types of violence as not being worthy of protection. So really, what I'm pushing for is a deeper understanding of how mobility, either through deportation or migration, plays a role in violence and death. And this will really help validate people's fears and understand the dangers that people are in. Oscar Misael Hernandez asks, when can we start talking about migranticidio, migranicide? This targeting or even killing of people for simply being migrants has reached an alarming level, but has really failed to galvanize the public. largely because the migrants come from all over, right? They're on their way somewhere else, and they have for years suffered in silence as a complicated, large, and diverse group of people. You know, migrants always have this perception as not tied to here, and therefore they are of somewhere else and going somewhere else, making it difficult for there to be significant mobilization about who they are. And these diversity of goals and destinations has really made it hard to recognize the violence that has been ingrained on human mobility, allowing us to neglect the systematic murder and disappearance of migrants and deportees for these past few decades. And we are talking about tens of thousands of people disappeared in Mexico with mass graves that really we will take decades more to sort out and understand what has been happening in many of these regions. But thank you so much for listening to my talk. I want to thank Murphy Woodhouse for a lot of the photography that was in here, and some of my co-PIs on the survey, Daniel Martinez and Scott Wyford, as well as the many people that conducted surveys and have spoken to me over the years. I would really like to open up and hear some questions about anything that's going on. And if you want to hear more about both some of the changes under the Trump administration, as well as some of the work that's being done to create, to roll back some of these issues for the Biden transition, I'd be happy to talk about it. But thank you very much.
Hi there. I actually do have a question. You just a couple minutes ago mentioned, I think the word was macro liberalism. Can you clarify what that word is and maybe spell it for me?
Sure. Necro, N-E-C-R-O, liberalism. Okay. And, you know, kind of a play off of Mbembe's necropolitics, right?
Gotcha.
But thinking about how the liberal state engages in that, right? This idea of you will be given something by the state, but only if you prove your worth.
Right.
And I think this is something that kind of, at least for me, jumps out a lot in terms of asylum, because so many things are based not necessarily on whether or not you will be killed. It's the why and the how of it, right? And this is because there's this nexus needed for asylum claims. You have to be killed on account of race, religion, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, right? And so those are the categories that your violence against you has to fit into in order for it to be accepted. And on top of this, there's the kind of traditional liberal state evaluation on whether or not you're a good person, right? So you have to have the appropriate lack of criminal history, or kind of these sort of general characteristics that we see so common in who is eligible to receive things or not, right? And so kind of thinking that as a way to conceptualize this very uneven distribution of death, and the idea of which deaths should we prevent people from experiencing and which ones are just kind of fine.
Thank you for explaining that.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Jeremy. Do we have any other questions from the group? Until chaos ensues, I'll just ask people to open up their mic and ask a question. And if we get too rambunctious, I'll go to the hands up thing. But with that, I open the floor to questions. Does anyone have another question?
Hi, this is Laura Paskus. I would love to hear more about your thoughts on, kind of what's happened the past few years with the Trump administration, looking ahead to Biden, and kind of how you think we might get at some of these really seemingly crushingly huge issues and problems. If you have a minute to answer.
Yeah. No, sure. I think there's still a lot of unpacking that needs to be done before we get to the point where we really have a perfect understanding of the totality of what Trump did to immigration, right? He had about 465 executive orders on migration, right? So even I, who spend all my time on these things, can't keep up with that many. So like what we've really seen is massive attempts to curtail legal migration, right? I think at the beginning of the Trump administration, what we saw was essentially DHS, Border Patrol and ICE reverting to kind of early Obama year functioning, right? So in the later years under the Obama presidency, he created a lot of, and his secretary for DHS created a lot of enforcement priorities, right? And so this dramatically reduced the number of people who are being deported from the inside the United States, essentially saying you had to have a fairly severe criminal record to get removed. And that put the brakes on a ton of that removal, right? That Obama was getting a lot of heat for the deporter in chief conversations. And so the first few years of the Trump administration, we saw them just sort of ramping up interior enforcement in a very Obama-esque way. However, as things got a little bit more in depth and a little more sophisticated, this is where they started to see these truly draconian policies, right? And a lot of them got rejected, and kind of the most famous being the family separation, right? Of really doing a very haphazard and cruel approach to try and make it worse for people to apply for asylum, which is kind of, I think, at the heart of what they were doing, and created this huge backlash. There was a lot of other things that were against children too that should be mentioned, right? So one of them was making it more difficult for sponsors to claim children. So essentially, most unaccompanied minors have family in the United States they're going to meet up with. But in order for ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, to place them, they have to kind of contact and make that make contact, essentially. And the Trump administration said that you have to have a background check for everyone living in the household, and essentially using this as a way to deport people. And this caused the number of children in detention to explode, right? And so things like that of just gunking up the system and slowing it down and making people remain in detention longer were really common. And then there was a series of defeats. I was involved in a couple of the Supreme Court lawsuits that were related to the asylum ban. So one that we won was to stop people who cross between ports of entry from applying for asylum. And that one was dismissed because Congress has special provisions if you cross between ports of entry. And so they've literally written this in the law. It's actually in some ways better for you to cross between the ports of entry than to cross at the port of entry and apply for asylum. You can get bond, essentially. If you cross it at the port of entry, ICE has to grant you parole, whereas an immigration judge can give you bond if you cross between ports of entry. So that one was let go, but then a lot of the more subtle laws came after, where they started to win. And really the biggest program, the biggest blow to asylum was the migrant protection protocols. And so MPP, as it's called, but also Remain in Mexico, was people would cross the border, apply for asylum, and then be sent back to Mexico to wait for their hearings to kind of complete and to see whether or not they would win. And only a handful of people won before it was kind of stopped during COVID. And this project was so successful and so bad, I think, in many ways, because it fit the same policies and practices that CBP already did, right? So I think building on the previous bureaucracy made it really functional, because CBP, Border Patrol have traditionally apprehended people and then taken them back to Mexico fairly quickly, right? That's what they like to do. They don't like to do as much paperwork. They don't like to deal with children. They don't like to let people go, right? These are all the things that have kind of been vocally criticized by that agency. And so MPP really fit in exactly with what they wanted to do. And that made it really popular and really easy. And so you saw the numbers really skyrocket, especially here in El Paso. And it also created a ton of violence in Mexico because people were stuck on the streets. You arrive through certain mechanisms and there are people there to help you, but this was a totally new way of being removed. And so a lot of people were coming directly from Guatemala and crossing through like Janos and Antelope Wells, right? If you know southern New Mexico, middle of nowhere. And then they would find themselves in Juarez, where they'd never been, don't know anybody, don't have any contacts. There was no shelter space for anyone. And so really created a humanitarian disaster here. Under COVID, like I said, it's this Title 42 returns where just there is no asylum. You cross and you get sent back. It doesn't matter where you're from. Doesn't matter if you're a child. Doesn't matter what your issue is. They're just expelling everyone, which I think is pushing people towards undocumented migration. But on the other hand, there is kind of some, like, I think, broader structural changes to how people migrate that came about under Trump, which I don't think are going to go away no matter what we do, which is, I think, asylum or asylum adjacent migration is here to stay, right? I think people have realized that this system still affords them a lot more benefits than crossing undocumented. And that's a major shift. And I think it's one of the big challenges for a Biden administration to deal with. And I'm guessing that there's going to be a big likelihood that we see like TPS being granted. So temporary protected status, which has been kind of, criticized as a bit of a limbo. But it's usually what we've done after big natural disasters or after civil wars that we were involved in and don't really want to take full responsibility for, as a way of kind of wiping people off the court docket. And so I think we'll see TPS for some big groups of people in a Biden administration, just to clear the backlog, right? Because, I was on a case last week that got pushed back, and it got pushed back 2 years. So every time there is a hearing, the next one, there's no space for two to 4 years, depending on where you are. There's about 1.5 million backlog in terms of asylum cases. So it's a really inefficient and difficult system. I don't know if that answers, it's kind of a long-winded answer. We've also been working on a couple of other things about how do you roll back some of these programs. And luckily, most of them are executive orders, so you can probably change most of them. But we'll see how that process goes for sure.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Rebecca has a follow-up question. How does the dynamic you've discussed tie into DACA and the prospect of DACA in the future?
Yeah, so DACA is a good example of the kind of clown car incompetence that typified the early Trump administration, right? The only reason it got saved in the Supreme Court was because it was executed so poorly, right? It was literally just done in such a bad way. They said, we can't accept your homework. The ruling clearly stated from the majority judges that if you go back and you do this again, you'll be fine, right? And so you can really see the Trump administration having a lot of trouble executing things from a pure incompetence standpoint at the beginning of their term. And they're starting to get a lot more effective, which is really scary. And so, especially with the Biden administration, I do not see any problems for DACA, right? They're gonna stop that dead in its tracks and DACA will be fine. Now, they've got a bigger challenge than I think a lot of people recognize, in that these agencies that are carrying out immigration, both in terms of USCIS granting people visas, have really internalized a lot of the Trump dynamics. And I think that there's going to be a lot of problems in terms of making sure that they follow these rules, right? USCIS put out a very Trumpianly worded statement about how illegal and how awful it is that the Supreme Court made them keep doing DACA, and they've dragged their feet on renewing people's DACAs, right? And so I think that dealing with the institutional culture and how those bureaucracies engage with this is going to be a bigger challenge than the simply kind of saving DACA from a legal standpoint.
Thank you, Jeremy. Do we have another question from the audience? And again, with a limited number of folks chiming in, we can just open up your mic and ask your question.
I just wanted to check with you about, what do you think this new status we have of the closed border crossings for non-essential traffic kind of brings to this current dynamic? This really is like the perfect neoliberal setup. Goods can cross borders and people can't. and people that do cross under Title 42 are immediately deported, which will probably change in January. But it is this new dynamic that Mexico has agreed to with the United States.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. It's a great question, Andy. Yeah, it's a total inversion, right? Where we're seeing where we, for most of our history, goods have been controlled and taxed, whereas people were fairly free. And now it's the ultimate reverse, and it's so status driven, right? If you are a U.S. citizen or resident, your travel is essential, period, right? It's really about excluding certain visa categories. And one of my, when COVID lockdowns came, I was like, oh, this would be interesting if we had like egalitarian immobility, right? If this affected people who are wealthy in the same way that it affected people who are poor. Of course not, right? That will never happen, right? But it's funny too how the Mexican governors have really supported this. And they've really supported this because of shopping. Because they realize that a lot of the people that cross on certain types of visas that are excluded are going to buy stuff in the United States, and they would rather them buy that stuff in Mexico, and this is helping their economy in a big way, right? I think, El Paso has something like $400 million worth of, tourist bought goods in our stores every year. So you can see that there is some ways that the Mexican government sees this as a win. It's very strange. There's a lot of ways that COVID kind of exposes these strange cross-counting ideologies and goals right now. So I'm not sure how long that's going to last, but I think that there will be, there was a push from Mexico to keep it going recently, and I think we'll see that for a while.
Yeah, I mean, it just renews every 30 days now.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's been a lot of, they were allowed to change some of it, but nobody spoke up, and they just kind of kept it going, which is strange. But yeah, so I don't know how that's going to work in the future.
Yeah, I just know because, in El Paso, it's like the really strange dynamic of you no longer have the weekend tourism of people coming over from Juarez to visit, everything. And but I mean, the Chihuahua State's pretty happy with the arrangement that we have.
Yeah, they love it. Yeah, it is. And it is wild in this sense. So, who knows how that'll shape out in the future, but, some people are starting to get frustrated at it. Other interests are really kind of tapping into it. So I don't know.
Do we have another question from folks in the group? Again, just open up your mic and ask your question of Jeremy.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering if you could go into what determines whether someone is deported to their home country or just straight back across the border to Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, typically, especially before the Trump administration, you're always deported to your home country or another country where you have status, right? So you can opt, if you're in front of an immigration judge, say, hey, like, I have a visa in, Ecuador, so I'd rather go there than Honduras or something like that, right? Except for when it's a contiguous country, right? So you can't opt in Mexico or Canada, right? Because in the past, Central Americans used to pretend to be Mexican, right? Just so they don't have to travel all the way back as far. So they don't allow you to opt in Mexico or Canada. But Trump changed that, right? So with the Remain in Mexico program, this is for the first time that they're essentially removing people to Mexico who weren't from Mexico, purposely. And under Title 42, this is considered, but continued in a very haphazard way, right? Sometimes people are sent home to their home country, and sometimes they're deported to Mexico. A report came out recently, a lot of children are being sent back to Mexico, which is really screwed up, so unaccompanied minors. And a lot of this, it started in May of 2019. And it started with just Central Americans, so just Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And then they added Cubans and then they added Brazilians, and there was talk of adding, so then they added Cubans, and then they added everybody who was from a Spanish-speaking country. And they're like, Brazil, that's almost a Spanish-speaking country. We'll do them too, right? And then they were talking about kind of accelerating it, including a lot of the African migrants as well. But that was really the criteria that they based that program on. And then one of the main reasons that lawsuit was allowed to go forward was because the Mexican government didn't object. Right, that was another one that I was working closely on as an expert. Is that the Mexican government didn't push back, and I think understanding the dynamic between Trump and AMLO in this sense of the economics of the situation is huge, right? Mexico's president, this kind of pseudo leftist populist, it's become really clear that his main goal is, I want to improve working class Mexicans' economic situation. And I'll do that by directly transferring money from the government to working class Mexicans, not super poor, working class. And he knew that the hit that they would take by closing off trade would have been disaster for that goal. And so he was really quick to throw migrants from Central America under the bus, created this National Guard to stop people crossing through Mexico, and also allowed this Remain in Mexico program to go forward. And they haven't really made much noise about it since. So, we'll see, because the lawsuit essentially won in the Ninth Circuit, and then the appeal allowed the program to go into effect in May. And then it just kind of exploded, went the entire border. So it was really, really this strange collaboration between both countries.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you, Jeremy and Roland, for your question. Another question from the group? I have a question. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, could you just talk a tiny bit more about the dynamics of the drug cartels and their relationships and how those have changed over, the last little bit, just to fill us in for those of us who don't really know so much about that dynamic?
No, yeah, great question. So we're entering almost, over 10 years of pretty sustained conflict in Mexico now. I would say probably the biggest changes is that you used to have these not totally uniform, but fairly uniform groups, right? That had some significant kind of leadership and then top down and the same name. You had your Sinaloa cartel, Zetas, Gulf cartel. You had some slight variations on that theme, but you had, 6 or 7 major cartels. What's happened over the course of this conflict is that a lot of these groups have fractured severely, right? So right now, in terms of Tamaulipas, you have what's called the Zetas Old School, the Cartel del Noreste, the Northeastern Cartel, and the Gulf Cartel, all sort of kind of fighting over the pie, and often sort of fighting over the name of the Zetas, right? So the Northeast Cartel del Noreste is really the Trevino family cartel. So Miguel Ángel Trevino became the leader of the Zetas after the kind of original paramilitary people that defected from Mexican special forces formed that group, right? These are it's kind of that classic US goes and trains special forces and then they become a drug cartel, like super happy story. And so then it's sort of fracturing into, are we a traditional cartel that is like family inheritance, or are we more paramilitary? And so this same dynamic has happened a lot of places where it's been described as balkanization. So you have a lot of smaller regional groups that are part of larger drug cartels, but very nominally, right? So they receive drugs and guns and they have sort of kind of some interactions, but nobody wants to be the next El Chapo, and no one wants to have that direct contact with everyone anymore. And so it's a lot of hands off, and you have these kind of regional groups that have their own names, but they also go by the big cartel names. So it's very difficult geography right now, very chaotic. And so, you know, looking at last year's homicide data, Guanajuato is one of the most violent states in Mexico, which is crazy, right? Guanajuato is a tourist state. I love Guanajuato. It's like San Miguel Allende. All the movies you see of like pretty kind of cathedrals are filmed there. But they're fighting over the theft of oil and gas from Mexico's state-run industry, right? Pseudo state-run. And so the conflict has changed and it goes a lot of different places now. And a lot of people are fighting amongst themselves, but also working together. It's just a very chaotic geography at the moment with a lot of strange players. But I think a lot of the kind of big players are keeping their heads down because, you know, El Chapo was just too big, too famous, too embarrassing, right? You don't go do an interview with Sean Penn. Like, you know, that's not the way to do this. A lot of people took that message to heart. And so we have this kind of real dispersing. The only one that was probably an exception to that is the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the Jalisco cartel, which is really kind of filled in a vacuum there a little bit and growing. But it is quite crazy. I mean, I can go on too, because the AMLO has his abrazos no balazos policy, right? The hugs not bullets approach to this, which again, he wants to focus on economic payments. He doesn't, and he has the idea that, oh, that's security, right? If we improve economic situations, this will mean better security. And it probably will in 20 or 30 years, but in the interim, it's pretty rough, right? And so we see homicides increasing, kidnapping increasing. And, you know, about a year ago, that event where Mexican police forces arrested Chapo's son to extradite him. And then the cartel just starts like destroying the city. And so they release him. Not a good look, right? And really created copycats everywhere, right? So in Juarez, we'll see this too, where people just burn a bunch of buses with people on them in order to get what they want. And because it is this kind of sort of negotiation tactic with the government now, it's a pretty rough situation for sure.
Sorry, thank you. Another question from the group? I'll use my bully pulpit as the mic and ask a quick question of Jeremy. You noted that you would expect an increase in TPS under the Biden administration and that you feel that DACA would be more stable and secure. Can you share with us your ideas on maybe 2 or 3 other things that you would expect the Biden administration to do very early on in its time in office with respect to immigration?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think rolling back MPP, I think rolling back the asylum ban, which basically says you have to apply in the third country before you're allowed to apply in the United States, apply and be denied in another country if you cross through another country. Basically made it so that only Mexicans and Canadians are allowed to apply for asylum, because everyone else has to kind of go over another country. He'll take away that, I think, for sure. One that I've been thinking that might be possible, I've had gotten in some arguments about this one with some of the more lawyerly folks from like Center for Migration Studies and the ACLU, but I think DAPA is a possibility under Biden, right? So DAPA was like the second administrative action that the Obama administration took to deal with immigration, right? So DACA was for individuals who arrived here as children, have been here over a certain amount of time and had no criminal record, right? Or no serious criminal record. But DAPA was for deferred action for the parents of Americans, right? And DAPA would have given 5 million people status right away. Now, a federal judge in Texas kind of single-handedly stopped it in its tracks, and it was working its way forward when it got hit. So I would see that the Biden administration taking up something like that, right? Especially because Obama already did it. I feel like they would be interested in kind of preserving that legacy and pushing it forward. some people have like I said, I got in an argument about this, and some of the lawyer people are like, no, the judge's decision was actually really solid and really strong. And essentially it was broken down to whether or not there would be funding for the processing of those visas in it. And so they have to have some sort of congressional approval. But I see something like that happening. That could be a really good way of bringing a ton of people out of the shadows. And I think, you know, we have to sort of think incrementally at this point, right? DACA is way better than being undocumented. It's not as good as making people citizens, right? Something like DAPA, something like TPS, again, these would get people out of the deportation machine, but they don't get them fully involved in becoming US citizens. And so I think that process is really important to keep in mind. And I don't necessarily know how much political capital the Biden administration would really expel on this. And so what that means to me is that they might be able to do a lot of things to kind of slow this down. But if we have kind of dueling Republican and Democratic administrations that give and take away deferred statuses, that's not a fun situation, right? It's not a fun situation to live in. It's not a fun situation to think about in terms of the long term. So hopefully there's some more permanent solutions there, or at least some of these things could contain some paths to citizenship. But for the moment, I'm not really sure.
Thank you, Jeremy. I've got 3:59. We want to be considerate of Jeremy's time, but does anyone have a closing question they would like to pose to our visitor before we let him get back to his family? Seeing and hearing none, Jeremy, I just want to thank you very much. This has been an extremely difficult time for everyone. And I really appreciate you carving out the time on a Friday afternoon and presenting your work with us. I wish you the best with the book and with your work doing. And with that, I would invite the participants to open up a reaction and perhaps give a thumbs up or a hand wave to Jeremy and thank him for his work.
And
Thank you guys so much.
I'll just remind everybody, we've got another colloquium next Friday. We don't even get a week off this time. So we'll be same time, same place next Friday at 3 o'clock.
Maria,
Thanks.
promise me you're not going to make them come back over Thanksgiving break. There's commitment, but.
No, we
Well,
won't be
okay.
back. We won't be
All
back.
right.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you.
Jeremy. That was really great.
People that I know there. Too bad we can't chat in person. But hi everybody, and it's great seeing everyone. And this is a lot of fun. So please keep in touch in the future. And also one quick plug is I think not this year, but next year we're going to have open applications for students who want to work with immigration related research for community organizations here along the border. And so we have this NSF funded program with Neil Harvey at NMSU. And so always looking for great students who want to get involved and get some hands-on research experience.
Thank you for the offer. We can provide details to that if anyone's interested. And again, Jeremy, I just thank you. Thank everyone for coming today. I hope folks have a safe and restful weekend and be well. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank
Maria and I
you.
will sit in the room for another minute and just let people step off.